with UK-based futurist and social commentator Mal Fletcher today. Mal, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Marius.
Mal, you've been travelling around South Africa over the last few days speaking to leaders about the future, about technology and the way that a digital, connected global world is going to change the world in which we live. What are the major technological trends that we should be looking at, that we should be thinking about?
Well, I think there's two in particular. There are many, but two in particular. One is digitisation, the other is automation. Digital has already changed our lives. There's a study that came out in London which said that 1/3 of all British adults will regularly check their smartphone under the covers of the bed at night. Something like half of all 18 to 24-year-olds are doing that now. And that's remarkable when you think that 2007 saw the advent of the very first iPhone. And digitisation's done a lot for industry too. It's given us open innovation, you know, people working together to solve global problems in a way we didn't do before. So we've got medicine working with IT, working with what's called additive manufacturing, to give us the possibility of, in maybe 8 years, building an entire human organ for transplant purposes on a version of a 3D printer.
We often hear talk about future fitness, getting ready for the digital revolution or the fourth industrial revolution. But of course, these technologies bring challenges. What does it mean for society in general and organizations as they adopt these technologies? What do they need to be thinking about?
Well, that brings the subject of automation into play, because that's what the fourth industrial revolution is all about, or the smart age as some are calling it. One of the dangers of automation, of course, is underemployment. And we're expecting globally something like 230 million jobs to be automated out of existence in the next 20 to 30 years. 35% of British jobs will be gone in 30 years. And whereas in the past those jobs were believed to have been, you know, blue-collar, low-paid, low-skilled jobs. Just last week in Britain we had the first robotic surgery on a human cornea, which is highly intricate, precise, you know, surgery. So automation is going to affect the highest paid jobs in society, and tech will open up new jobs, but the question is, will human beings be able to adapt fast enough and make the transition between jobs?
So of course this raises a range of ethical questions around what leaders or policymakers, CEOs of companies should be doing. How do we as a society cope with these changes and enjoy the benefits without seeing some of the downsides?
Well, I think, you know, leaders of companies and leaders of civic organisations are essentially cultural architects. They build an environment in which people can flourish and projects fly. That's their role. And as cultural architects, we need to be building, for example, cultures of autonomy in an age of automation. So I call it humanising the digital, making sure that there's a part within our corporate structure that allows for people to do this. The Bank of America found last year with a study, 90 of its workers were given censored badges and asked to just go about their lives for a week. And at the end of the week, it was found that the ones who produced the most mingled the most. So the biggest bank in America, changed its whole coffee break mentality to bring people together and discourage digital engagement during that time.
Mal, you're of course London-based. You look at the world from that position and you look at Europe. The last time you visited us at GIBS and in South Africa, you spoke about the future of Europe. You spoke about ever-increasing union in Europe, and then we saw Brexit. What should we be thinking about for the future of Europe? What do you see happening at the moment?
Marius, I think Europe as a region has a brilliant future, whatever happens to the EU. The EU's question is whether it's willing to be more honest and transparent with its own citizens. And that term ever closer union is the elephant in the room that hardly anybody still wants to talk about. And yet it's the linchpin of the EU. Does it mean an ever closer trading bloc, or does it mean political union which leaves national governments playing the role of modern city-states, essentially? I think that matters to people in Europe. There are big swings in Germany, Italy and France now towards debating that question in a way that hasn't been done before. And these are heart nations where the EU experiment is concerned. So I think that's the acid question for the EU. Does it keep pushing this agenda without open debate, or does it bring it to the people once and for all and say, do we want a United States of Europe?
We've been watching with great interest the presidential election race in the USA. Hillary Clinton, a very experienced political leader, bureaucrat, technocrat in many ways, compared to Donald Trump, who maybe could be described as a TV personality. What's your view on that election, and what should we be looking for as they go to the polls?
Well, look, I think for me, and this is a personal view, I think for me, reading all the research that's been done, watching the news as you do, it's a pretty poor choice for Americans. It's almost like the American experiment has become too experimental now. You've got on one hand Hillary Clinton, who in my view is almost willing to do anything to have power. She shifts her policies according to polls very regularly. Doesn't seem to have any core belief in behind it all. On the other hand, you've got Donald Trump, who's a complete political novice and prone to say whatever comes into his head, which when you're the President of the United States is a very difficult proposition. So I think a lot of Americans, thinking Americans now, are asking, is this the best that we can do? You know, the city on a hill, as Reagan called it. Is this the best that we can do? I think either way there are checks and balances on the president, so either way it wouldn't be a total disaster. I do have concerns, though, about foreign policy, which is the one area where the American president has some freedom.
From a global perspective, we saw under the leadership of President Obama, America attempt to pivot towards Asia with the rise of China, growing trade relationships there, but at the same time having real challenges in the Middle East, bogging the Americans down in terms of foreign policy. As a leader of a global multinational corporation or someone who has a global influence, what are some of the perspectives we need to have around the way the globe is changing, not just the influence of America, but the broader global community?
Well, if you're talking about corporate leadership, I think the question of ethics is hugely important. And I think more and more global leaders in the corporate sense now are getting involved in ethical questions and trying to answer ethical questions. I mean, China may have a rapidly growing economy until fairly recently. It's slowed down a bit now. Some say it's about to shrink. But either way, there are still great ethical questions about the way China is governed. And I think corporate leaders sometimes have left it too much to politicians to deal with those issues, where it's the corporate leader that has the leverage to force change or to at least suggest and encourage change. I think that's hugely important in banking, in finance, and in corporate life generally.
So, Mel, we've seen the rise of global multinational corporations. We've seen the world become increasingly interconnected and globalized. And this has asked certain things of leaders that can be, as you've said, culture builders, that can relate to different kinds of people. What do you think are the 2 or 3 key characteristics that leaders of the future are going to need to have?
They need to be able to build cultures of meaning. McKinsey discovered 2 years ago in a global survey of corporate leaders that the thing teams want most from their leaders but aren't given is meaning in the work. And people today, in an age of data explosion, disjointed data, need a common narrative to tie it all together. They want to know not just what we do in this company, but what we stand for. And they need to have sight lines drawn to show them how you in your individual workstation help us to achieve that big picture story. That narrative culture, I would call it, is very important, especially to millennials under 35 and Gen Z or Gen Edge, as I call them, under 20, because they're narrative generations. Almost every form of information that comes to them has a story attached today. Even social media is a form of storytelling, stream of consciousness style. So there's an important thing here for leaders to learn to tell the story of the company and then find a way to draw sight lines for each member.